I'm Jasmine El Gamal, and this is The View from Here. Last week, the IPC, which is a UN-backed global body that monitors food insecurity and malnutrition around the world, officially declared a famine in Gaza. So I sat down with someone who knows a lot about this issue. Alex Smith has worked on issues related to global health, international humanitarian law, and international criminal law in various conflict zones around the world for 23 years. He also worked at USAID throughout the conflict in Gaza until he resigned in protest over the agency's policies. I talked to Alex about how something so preventable can be allowed to happen, what is different about the famine in Gaza compared to other famines that he's worked on or witnessed in his career, and what message he has for policymakers about their responsibility to prevent this kind of thing. Alex Smith, welcome to The View from Here.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're really the perfect person, I think, to talk to about this. You've worked on global health issues, human rights issues, international criminal law, international humanitarian law for 23 years. You've worked with both US and UN aid agencies in multiple war-ravaged countries. You've worked in Afghanistan, Sudan, the occupied Palestinian territories. I mean, your experience is absolutely unparalleled on this issue. Alex, last week, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, something called the IPC, officially declared famine in Gaza. Now, the IPC is a UN-backed global monitor that tracks food insecurity and malnutrition. And this was the first time the IPC has declared a famine in the Middle East. So before, it's declared famine in Somalia in 2011, South Sudan in 2017 and 2020, and Western Darfur in mid-2024. So just that we're all starting out on the same page here, can you just tell us what a famine is and how it's different from just hunger?
So the IPC is an independent UN-backed organization. It's comprised of about 21 partner organizations, and that includes CARE International, Save the Children, FuseNet, which is a USAID-funded early warning system to flag food insecurity. The IPC gets its funding from EU, UK, Canadian, and German governments and others. And its main job is monitoring chronic hunger and malnutrition, as well as acute starvation. This started in the early 2000s. It was an initiative by aid agencies, food security specialists, and UN experts, and some UN agencies, in particular FAO, based in Rome, invested in answering specific needs. One of the needs was for basically a standardized metric for hunger, malnutrition, starvation, so that each organization wasn't having a different idea of when famine was imminent. But another problem that it sought to solve was the problem of humanitarian aid agencies having their operations suspended if they publicly flagged starvation, malnutrition, famine in a man-made crisis. So, for example, if Feed the Children came out and said there's forced starvation, there's famine, they could have their operations suspended and be banned from the country that they're working in. Whereas having this independent body that's made up of all these organizations gives them more protection to continue their operations.
Was there a specific incident that caused this, that sort of highlighted a need for this type of organization to focus on famine specifically?
There was several incidents. You mentioned already the Somali famine. That was really one of the the incidents that made the entire aid community sort of take stock and think, how can we prevent this from happening again? We need to do better. But also it was, I worked in Sudan for a year, and colleagues of mine were PNG'd, persona non grata, out of the country for saying too much about the starvation of people in Darfur. And so answering that need to have an independent body that can declare when starvation is happening and make policy recommendations came from those incidents.
And one of the things that we're going to be talking about in this episode is just this question of why does this keep happening again and again? And when I say this, we're not just talking about famine, of course. We're talking about, everything that we're seeing in Gaza today, everything that we're seeing in Sudan today, ethnic cleansing, forced starvation, mass displacement. This is not the first time we're seeing things like that. And I think really the overriding question, what I want to try to understand from you today, is why this keeps happening over and over again, and who's responsible for allowing it to happen over and over again. So can you share some of your experiences witnessing and working on famine related issues in these different countries and contexts that I just mentioned?
Going to your first question first, why does this keep happening? It's a really frustrating and important question. On the one hand, it's great to see media organizations treating this report with some weight, with some importance, and saying, this is a serious problem. On the other hand, it's incredibly frustrating to see all of the previous warnings go unheeded. The special rapporteur for food, Michael Fakhri, had an article out 3 weeks ago saying no one should be surprised by famine in Gaza. This has been ongoing for a very long time, and it's been getting worse. And all of these food security experts have been ringing this alarm bell for a very long time. It's as if, media organizations came out with a headline a couple of days ago that said 2 + 2 is 4. Oh my God. It's like, we knew this was going to happen. It's very obvious. It's been very, very much talked about and should have been predicted.
But Alex, sorry, can I stop you for a second? Because I don't think you've told us exactly what famine is and how it's different from hunger.
Famine is defined as the extreme lack of food within 20% of households, acute malnutrition among children under 5, reaching or exceeding 30%, unless it's done through mid-upper arm circumference measures, in which case it's 15%. We might talk about how that's been misunderstood intentionally later.
Mid-upper arm circumference,
It's a very simple tape measure that you can get on Amazon. It goes around a child's arm. And if their arm is so small, less than 12.5 centimeters, that the band goes all the way around into a red collar on their arm, then you know that they are experiencing acute malnutrition. And then the third measure is widespread death, measured in the form of excess mortality, which is at least 2 deaths per 10,000 people per day. When 2 of these conditions are met, they can reasonably infer that is famine, that is phase 5.
2 of the conditions, so not every single condition has to be met. You mentioned this MUAC, the measurement of the upper circumference of a child's arms to measure whether there's a famine or whether there's starvation. One of the accusations that the Israeli government and its supporters have launched since the report came out on famine is that the IPC has lowered its standards for the classification of famine so that they can declare a famine in Gaza. Can you just quickly address those allegations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the allegation didn't start just now. It started actually around August 12th. There was a story in the Washington Free Beacon, a conservative website, that claimed that the IPC had changed its data in order to find a finding of a famine. And then Kogat sort of took that and ran with it, saying that the IPC was putting pressure on Israel and vilifying it with false allegations of starvation. But it's a fundamental misunderstanding, probably an intentional misunderstanding of Kogat, of IPC's metrics. When the IPC is using height for weight and getting a Z-score that will tell you quite accurately if children are acutely malnourished within the communities that they're in. So you're getting a standard deviation that tells you in great detail about what's happening. That's the ideal way to do that measurement. But in conflict zones, you often have to use MUAC, that mid-upper arm circumference that we were talking about. And that's a less accurate way, and it tends to catch only about half of acute malnutrition cases. In other words, half are false negatives. Therefore, the metric is set at 15% instead of 30%. It was talked about in Israeli propaganda as something that was done quietly behind the scenes in order to frame Israel, basically. But this is a standard that's been used for the last 6 years. It was in the IPC technical manual that when you're using MUAC, you use 15% instead of 30%. And that was used in South Sudan and in Sudan as well in the determinations of famine there. Another, I think, really important thing to mention is that in my experience, it could be that the starvation, the malnutrition rather, is worse than can be reflected in the IPC report. And the reason I say that is because obviously there are parts of Gaza that are extremely hard to get to, where the starvation is probably the worst in unreported pockets. But also because you touched on this, the quality of food entering Gaza, from every report I've seen, it's usually in bulk things like flour, sugar, and oil. Physicians who are working there say that they have not seen vegetables or protein-rich foods, meat, eggs, that sort of thing, for the entire time that they've been there. And these foods are essential for nutrition, especially for children and pregnant and nursing women. So a diet of only flour, sugar, and oil, it might make your body big enough to not get flagged by that MUAC or be get a Z-score that flags malnutrition. But you're still going to be very malnourished. As you know, you can be obese and malnourished at the same time. And micronutrient deficiencies can mean poor health outcomes, poor cognitive development for children. It can limit the ability for women to breastfeed and to have healthy births. And it can really weaken an immune system such that you're very vulnerable to diarrheal and respiratory illnesses.
Thank you so much for making that point. I think this is a really important point that I didn't really think about, is that the difference that is that, so two things. Number one is similar to the death toll in Gaza, because independent organizations, journalists, monitors are not allowed in to Gaza and don't have full access. A lot of the things that we're seeing, that we're reading about, that some people will say, oh, those numbers are inflated in terms of the death toll or the starvation numbers. Actually, that one day when people do have full access into Gaza, that we will find out that actually those numbers were well below what was happening. And the second important point that you mentioned is really is the difference between being of a certain size and actually being healthy.
Yeah, that is key.
Yeah, so thank you for making that point, Alex. In the places that you've worked before, have you ever seen, famine up close, or engaged in policies and decision making to either prevent or address a famine before Gaza? Because we're going to get to Gaza in a second, but just sort of historically speaking, in terms of what you have seen and experienced before.
Yeah. My very first experience was unforgettable. It was early 2001 in refugee camps in Pakistan, which at the time had the largest refugee population of Afghan refugees, people who were escaping conflict as well as drought, overcrowding camps like Jalazai and Shamsha that were in the northwest part of Pakistan. I was a film major as an undergrad, but at age 21, 22, I was working for UNHCR as an intern, decided to go to these places to experience what was happening there. And did some documentation as well. I actually created a documentary film about that, what I saw. In Shamsha camp, there was starvation, there was malnutrition. People were arriving desperate with just the clothes on their backs. And the UN was very much overwhelmed. So there was starvation. There were people dying from malnutrition there. But I remember one particular cold morning we arrived at the camp from Peshawar to the camp. And the night before, we met a family who two of the boys had died, not due to malnutrition. They died due to cold. It was simply too cold that night. And then a few hours later, I saw trucks arriving with massive blankets, these giant duvets to keep people warm. But it was too late for those two boys. And I remember thinking at that time, at age 21, how could this happen? These deaths were, completely preventable if we just had the right resources in the right place at the right time. And so that's really part of why I decided to get into this field of health and human rights. From there, I went on to Afghanistan in 2002 and 2006, where malnutrition was a major part of the crisis due to drought and displacement and conflict. From there, I learned a very valuable lesson about when populations are displaced, as they are being displaced intentionally now in Gaza. That can create all kinds of food security problems. Also worked in Sudan for a year, circa 2007, 2008. And it was in Sudan that colleagues of mine were told to leave the country for bringing too much attention to the man-made famine there. By some serendipity, as a law student, I ended up working at the International Criminal Court in The Hague around the same time that the prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo, was pursuing the president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, for genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes. And a key part of the warrant for Bashir was the destruction of livelihoods, was this question of starving people, and in particular in that situation, it was about water, denying people life-saving aid, materials that were indispensable to preserving life. And that was sort of the first time that the ICC really included that in a warrant as a serious act of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So that was sort of a formative and inspiring lesson also, that there should be international tribunals, international accountability mechanisms that can punish crimes like that, not just when people are killed with bombs and bullets, but also when people are denied food, when they're denied life-saving materials.
Yeah, exactly. I think we tend to think of war as bombs and bullets, like you just said, but actually it's more than that. It's things like using aid, using food, like you said, really getting at the livelihoods of people. It's not just about lives, but it's about livelihoods. It's about preventing access to medication. It's about preventing access to a healthcare system or the destruction of a healthcare system. All of these things that I think, the average person may not really grasp, that those are all tools of war. I mean, you've seen that up close. It's really poignant to me to hear you talk about these boys dying of the cold when there were blankets just so readily available, and when and then they arrive, just too late to save them. And really just this question of, this is not a case of things being unavailable. This is a case of things not being accessible. And there's a huge difference between the two. So that brings me to Gaza. I mean, let's get right into it, because one thing that really stands out in my mind, like I said, is just how preventable this was. So we have this famine declaration. It's now August of 2025. So as early as November 2023, so a month after October 7th, there were dire warnings about famine and starvation in Gaza. I mean, that's very, very clear looking back. On November 16th, we see the World Food Programme saying that Gaza faced widespread hunger as food systems collapse. And the head of the World Food Programme, Cindy McCain, said supplies of food and water are practically non-existent in Gaza, and only a fraction of what is needed is arriving through the borders. With winter fast approaching, unsafe and overcrowded shelters, and the lack of clean water, civilians are facing the immediate possibility of starvation. The immediate possibility of starvation. This was in November of 2023. Only one border crossing was operational at the time that Cindy McCain made this statement. And she also said that fuel shortages, because it's not only food and water that were being withheld, but fuel as well for generators and things like that. And so those fuel shortages had already triggered a halt in bread production across all 130 bakeries in Gaza. So that's November of 2023. Now, the IPC, which is what we're talking about, was the body that just issued this famine declaration. It issued its first report in December 2023, so 2 months in, warning of famine in Gaza if conditions persisted. And at this point, we're already seeing news reports and stories of people foraging for wild herbs because they can't find food, or drinking sewage contaminated water or rainwater because there's no fresh water sources. I was reading back then about babies being born underweight because their mothers were malnourished, and babies even dying of malnutrition because also the healthcare system was starting to be attacked by Israeli forces as well. So again, all of this is December 2023.
By March of 2024, doctors were reporting from Gaza that they were no longer seeing normal birth weight babies, that all babies were malnourished when they were born.
All babies. Of course, because their mothers are malnourished. So, I mean, what do you expect? So, January 2024, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, in a case brought by South Africa against Israel on charges of genocide, the ICJ then orders Israel to undertake a set of provisional measures to prevent genocide in Gaza. So they're saying, while we look at this situation and determine whether this is plausible genocide, there are a certain set of measures that Israel needs to take, and other states that parties to the Genocide Convention, to prevent genocide, to make sure that we don't get there, right? So as part of those provisional measures, the ICJ says that Israel must, and I'm quoting here, Israel must take immediate and active measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. March 2024, the same IPC warns that famine is imminent in northern Gaza, and that 1.1 million people, which is half of Gaza, were experiencing catastrophic food insecurity. The ICJ also in March issues additional provisional measures, focusing specifically on famine this time. In May 2024, so you can see the pattern of warnings here. And we can see international organizations starting to get involved with the ICJ and the ICC. So in May 2024, the ICC, which is the International Criminal Court, issues arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and the Defense Minister at the time, Yoav Gallant. And included in that arrest warrant is the charge of using starvation as a method of warfare. So the warnings of famine are happening, and at the same time, this starvation is actually used in criminal cases, and the accusations that it's deliberately being used as a method of war. Now, we all remember Yoav Gallant on October 8th, the day after the October 7th attacks, famously said publicly, "We are imposing a complete siege on Gaza. There will be no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything will be closed. We are fighting human animals, and we are acting accordingly." So I want to note here, before I turn it back to you, Alex, that although what's happening in Gaza right now is not the first man-made famine, it's not the first preventable famine, but there are two unique aspects of it. It's the first famine under the IPC since the IPC started, where starvation was also, as I just said, was being prosecuted simultaneously as a war crime. And the second unique aspect of it is something you told me when we were speaking yesterday, is that it happened uniquely fast. So it went from the first warnings to a full-blown official famine in less than 2 years. So the question now that obviously stands out is, how did this happen? Given all of these warnings that I just laid out, and the fact that this was all happening in real time, how did this happen? You were in the US government this entire time. You were working at USAID. And so I want you to place us inside the US government when all of these warnings were happening. This was during the Biden administration. Today, you have former Biden administration officials saying, if it wasn't for us, nothing would have gotten in at all. We made so much of a difference. They've always been saying that. In fact, in May 2024, one of your former colleagues, Stacey Gilbert, resigned in protest after the Biden administration released a report that concluded Israel was not blocking aid. So all the while in government, the Biden administration is saying everything's fine. Israel is not blocking aid. Yes, they could do better, but, it's not a big deal. So tell us about what was happening behind the scenes at the time, the conversations that were happening, the debates, and where you were in all of those conversations.
Yeah, sure thing. Let me back up to one of your other questions about how this conflict is different. And yeah, you're absolutely right about the ICJ provisional measures. They're called. They're basically orders from the ICJ saying, in order to not commit genocide, Israel needs to take these very specific steps. And one of them was to allow food aid unfettered. So the whole history, you mentioned that there have been man-made famines in the past. And honestly, today, if you talk to food security experts, really all food security problems today are man-made. Famines are generally man-made these days. They're not for lack of resources. They're for lack of political will to feed people or intentionally starving people. And as Alex Duvall, who's a great authority on starvation and conflict and has written a book about this, likes to say, most colonial powers, including the United States, have used starvation as a weapon. This isn't really a new thing. A notable example was the Bengal famine in 1943, instigated in large part by Winston Churchill. Present generations of Bengali people are still suffering the health effects from that famine. And we expect to see the same in Gaza generations from now. People still suffering ill health consequences because of this starvation campaign. I'll just mention also Assad's regime in Syria was using starvation in a very similar way to how Israel is using it today. They had a strategy that was basically surrender, meaning the rebel communities, or starve, and starving, 1 million people in the rebel-held areas because they refused to lay down their arms, as has been said recently. But how is Gaza different? Previous starvation campaigns that I've seen in the past have been horrific. What makes this campaign, Israel's starvation campaign, different is, as you said, the pace of the starvation, how thoroughly and systematically this has happened. If you look at the sudden spike in child malnutrition, if you look at the maternal health indicators before and after the assault, Gaza used to have a maternal mortality ratio lower than the United States before this attack on Gaza. The Famine Review Committee has also noted that this situation is unique and that they've had to go back 5 times to this situation. And they said, quote, "That's a stark reflection on how the suffering has not only persisted but intensified and the spread and spread until famine has begun to emerge." And that's remarkable also in the ICJ context, that the ICJ made this order, stop starving Gaza, and then Israel actually increased the starvation campaign, actually decreased the amount of aid getting in, which is remarkable. And that, that this is being done with so much publicity. It's being done publicly and with so much total impunity that the leaders who are perpetrating this crime are apparently quite confident that they can get away with it, and they can even say things to media, usually Israeli media in Hebrew, about wanting to starve the Palestinians, and they're completely comfortable and they think that that's fine. But yeah, as you say, I've never seen a starvation campaign so admitted to, with Yoav Gallant saying we're cutting off all food, fuel, and water on day one. It makes lawyers who work on this issue and public health people want to pull our hair out, because they literally confessed to what they were about to do, and then they did it for 22 months. And yet you still have Western leaders doubting whether this is a problem or whether this is illegal or whether this is okay somehow. So that is infuriating.
And we'll get to that, Alex, because I think one of the things that is allowing Israel to continue to do this and for Western governments to tolerate it, if not enable it, is the argument that Hamas steals the food, and so that's why they have to withhold the aid. So I want to make sure we address that side of it as well.
Yeah, it's a claim that's been thoroughly debunked.
I just wanted to make sure we address it for listeners who might have heard that and have that genuine question.
But your question about what was going on at USAID.
Yeah.
Early on in the genocide, Samantha Power, who has written multiple books about genocide, had very little to say about crimes being committed in Gaza. She did at one point say that there was famine when a senator put a very direct question to her about the conditions in Gaza, but she didn't talk about who was perpetrating the famine, that it was man-made, that Israel was causing it by not allowing aid into Gaza. Again, for somebody who's written multiple books about genocide and how the U.S. specifically needs to react better to genocide acts of genocide. It was quite a cowardly move. I think quite a few people in the leadership at USAID and in the U.S. government in general were far more concerned with their careers than doing the right thing or saying the right thing. Dissent cables were sent to USAID leadership and from USAID to the umbrella of the State Department as well. And they called for large-scale, unobstructed humanitarian aid access and a call and for the State Department to name what Israel is doing as wrong and illegal, and to correctly apply the Leahy laws, which should prohibit U.S. military aid to countries that are committing war crimes and or blocking U.S. aid. Obviously, those dissent cables sort of went into the ether, and we never had a reply. We never really heard anything back.
For listeners who don't know, can you explain what a dissent cable is in the U.S. government?
Sure thing. It's something that came out about a long time ago, I think in the 60s or 70s, to allow State Department officials to dissent from U.S. policy privately to the State Department, without the presumption being that they wouldn't then get fired for having a different opinion about things.
So they can state their opinion. They can, if they're not comfortable, if they disagree with the official U.S. policy, State Department employees, and that includes USAID, which was part of the State Department, they can write these cables called dissent cables. And the rule is that senior leadership at the department have to reply to every dissent cable that is pushed up. Was that happening? Were people responding to your dissent cables?
No, there was never a reply, and there wasn't a reply for my to my resignation either.
And we'll get to your resignation. So you're in government, and you're seeing obviously that there's no real response to what's happening, to all these warnings. What did it really look like on the inside? Who are the voices inside of government who were ignoring this? Was there anyone making excuses for this? I mean, because all of these people are out there now. All of the top leadership, all of the top people, Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Brett McGurk, all of them are out there at Harvard, on CNN, in the Wall Street Journal. And I want listeners to know what was really going on inside of government throughout this whole time.
Surely, it was simply a lot of cowardice and a lot of self-censorship. In my case, I was literally censored, but for most people in senior positions in USAID and in the State Department, it was about not wanting to ruffle feathers. Harrison Mann from the military wing, who is also a resignee, one of the people who resigned, talked about how people in his chain of command also just wanted to go along with things, didn't want to ruffle feathers, censored themselves, didn't say anything because they just thought it was easier not to. So it was just cowardice on a monumental scale. But as you mentioned, a lot of these people who made these decisions and were spokespeople giving political cover for the genocide are now slowly trying to rehabilitate their images and get back into think tanks and get back into academia, and make public statements about how they were actually against this genocide the whole time. They knew there were war crimes, but they felt they couldn't say anything. Matthew Miller is a classic example. He's given multiple interviews about how he knew that Israel was committing war crimes. He knew that Netanyahu 7 times derailed peace talks, ceasefire agreements. He didn't say that when he was the spokesperson, but he is saying it now in an effort to rehabilitate himself.
Well, it's not just that he didn't say that. He refuted reporters who were asking him about that.
Yep. Always with a smirk. He would always sort of look down on reporters for daring to even ask such a question.
So do you think there was an explicit decision to ignore all of this, or was it just sort of like, oh, we don't really know what to do, maybe it's best that we don't say anything? Or was it more explicit and, in terms of like, no, we are going to refute this. We are going to refute and deny the fact that this is happening, that the Israeli government is not allowing all the assistance it can allow in. Anthony Blinken testified to Congress that that was the case. And I'm asking that question because you said something, you referenced the Leahy law, which I want you to explain in a bit more detail, that if U.S. government officials had admitted that Israel was not allowing the proper amount of assistance in, or that it was not allowing U.S. assistance in, that would have triggered U.S. laws that would have forced the U.S. government to stop its support for Israel, or the Israeli government or the Israeli military in its prosecution of this war. So can you talk a little bit about that, the ramifications of if they had actually admitted what was happening?
Yeah, quickly, the Leahy laws forbid foreign assistance to countries that are committing human rights abuses on a massive scale, which obviously this was the case. And there's other provisions in the Foreign Assistance Act that prevent U.S. military aid or any kind of aid going to a country that is blocking U.S. humanitarian aid, which was very obvious and apparent at the time. But because those laws were so explicit about what needed to happen, that's why these officials, all the way up to Blinken, were gaslighting and denying basic realities, basic truths about Israel allowing aid into Gaza. Very tellingly, Blinken in October of 2024, just before the election, a few weeks before the election, leaked a letter where he very openly says, you need to stop starving Gaza, you need to allow in aid, you need to do these very specific steps of, granting visas and allowing this many trucks per day. Otherwise, we can't continue to provide you with military aid. And it was put out as obviously a fig leaf to anti-genocide Democratic voters,
to show that Biden was actually doing something, because there was a lot of anger amongst potential voters that Biden was not doing enough. So this was just before the election. They released this letter they sent to the Israelis. What was so interesting to me about that letter, one thing that you just said, by asking the Israelis to stop, they were admitting that the Israelis had been doing this.
And admitting it in very minute detail about the steps that Israel was taking to blockade. They were saying, you need to stop doing these very specific things.
Yeah, which they had been denying that Israel had been doing for all these months. And then all of a sudden, this letter is released saying, please stop doing these things that we've been denying that you've been doing. I'm going to put the letter in the show notes so that people know what was said. The other interesting thing about the letter, as opposed to what it revealed and the timing of it, which was very, just cynical, right? Coming right before the election, is that it also gave a deadline of, I believe, 30 days, if I remember correctly.
Just after the election, yeah, that's right.
Which was just after the election, where it was like, if you don't do this, if you don't stop, or if you don't do this in 30 days, there will be consequences. Now, were there consequences after those 30 days?
Not a one. It was. They floated the idea of complying with U.S. and international law, but they weren't serious about it. And most people knew that, but it was obviously intended to convince people like me, who I did vote for Kamala, simply based on the idea that maybe they were serious about complying with U.S. and international law. That's what it was for. It was just a ruse to try to get people to vote for them.
And in the meantime, rather than try to address the issue, and rather than trying to put pressure on the Israelis to open up border crossings or allow aid in, all of these other mechanisms are then put into place to try to sort of get around the issue. So you had the Gaza Pier project, which was under the Biden administration, which turned out to be a complete disaster. And I'll link some articles to that as well in the show notes. But I'm sure most people who have been following this issue remember this giant, costly, expensive, heavy pier that was constructed to allow aid in. It was just essentially broken apart by rough waters and eventually completely dismantled about 3 months after it was put in place and after spending tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars on it. There was also, under the Trump administration, which is still ongoing, the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is this private entity, very shadowy. No one really quite knows who's behind it. And they have been presenting aid at various aid points. But the problem with that, of course, is that it doesn't take aid to the people who need it. It forces people to walk to them in extremely dangerous conditions, people who are already starving and weak. And on top of all of that, around 1,000 people have been shot as they have tried to get that aid from the GHF. And then lastly, you have airdrops. Again, so-called humanitarian airdrops, which are also very costly. This is when you drop boxes of aid from planes from the sky. Some of them, the parachutes fail to open in time. The boxes fall on people. They kill them. People in Gaza who've gotten to those boxes have said that often it's not the right kind of food. Sometimes it's expired, and sometimes they don't have anything to cook it with because they don't have fuel or water. So all of these things are being sort of put out there as potential solutions to this hunger crisis, then starvation, now famine. Had you ever seen sort of these outside the box, and I'm not saying that in a positive way, mechanisms being deployed to get food in, or
no,
was this
usually
the first
food
time?
is distributed in the easiest way possible by trucks or the available routes by organizations who know what they're doing. And I think the important point to make is that these systems are not really meant to alleviate the starvation, to prevent famine. The airdrops are extremely inefficient. The pier, as you said, didn't work, and the items coming in through the pier would have been checked by Israel anyway, just like the truck. So it really made no sense at all. It was purely performative. But the number one issue I have is with the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is shadowy to say the least. They, in the early days of their inception in February, made declarations about having UN experts on their board, to which the UN experts themselves said, "I'm not on their board. I have nothing to do with this organization." I wrote an article about this in DevX. I encourage people to read it. It's called "Blurring the Lines: Why We Don't Do This with Humanitarian Aid." Anybody who's an expert in or has any experience with delivering aid knows that this is exactly how you don't do it. You don't force people to go through a war zone to get to these 4 distribution centers when they used to have 400 distribution centers. You don't corral people into these metal cages. You don't shoot at them with guns, obviously. These are really problematic situations, and I honestly think that it's designed to fail, which kind of tracks with the previous 3 months of absolute starvation. Between March, April into May, 80 days of complete starvation, not 1 calorie, entered Gaza. Suddenly Israel comes up with the GHF, and we're supposed to believe that they'd changed their minds, that they decided they do want to start feeding Gaza. No, the GHF was created to fail. It was created to exacerbate the starvation, and now this is why we're at this point with famine, because the GHF was inefficient and it was designed not to work.
Yeah. And this is one of the things it reminds me of. So the EU, which is Israel's largest trading partner, has been under pressure for months to suspend their trade agreement with Israel, the EU-Israel trade agreement. And at some point, this was, I think in July, if I'm not mistaken, so a couple of months ago, at the height of the pressure campaign, including from within the EU by member states themselves, the EU foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, said, we have entered into an agreement with Israel. They have agreed to allow more assistance in. Therefore, there's no need for us to suspend the agreement at this time. And it occurred to me, and this is something that has been reported on in terms of tactics, that every once in a while, the Israeli government would allow assistance in, or would kind of say, okay, we're now opening, we're now, letting in, just enough for governments to be able to say, okay, well, we were going to do something, but we don't have to do something anymore because now the Israelis have opened the border and decided to let things in. So I just wanted to point that out too, because it's not just a tactic of starvation. It's also a tactic of kind of turning on the tap every once in a while to alleviate the pressure on the Israeli government itself.
Yeah, another way to frame that would be to say Israel is always going to, and has for the last 22 months, commit genocide to exactly the extent that they think they can get away with. When there's a few senators from the US, or where there's pressure from the EU or another body that could lead to consequences, they're always going to dial it back just enough to continue getting away with it.
Now, of course, the Israeli government over the last 2 years has been denying that there's starvation, and have also said that it's Hamas's fault. The UN, on the other hand, has repeatedly said that there's no evidence of systematic diversion of aid by Hamas or other armed groups, with the caveat, of course, Alex, that we have to say that in any conflict, there will be looting and chaos and and diversion of aid. But what the UN is saying is that there has been no systematic diversion of aid by Hamas, certainly not in any terms or quantities that would necessitate cutting off all of that aid going into Gaza. So can you just help us unpack this whole it's Hamas's fault argument?
Yeah, so the UN is really good at tracking where their aid goes. It's never going to be perfect, and aid can be taken by people and then sold on. And generally speaking, when there's desperate lack of aid, people with guns are going to take the aid, but that tends to be armed gangs in this case. The claim that Hamas was taking the aid goes quite far back. It goes well into 2024, early 2024. Weirdly, Israel was making that claim even at the same time that they were claiming that Hamas had been completely wiped out in northern Gaza. So Hamas had been wiped out, but yet was still somehow stealing all the aid for 1 million people in the north of Gaza. It's completely fantasy, but you'll still see people trotting out that line even today. Cindy McCain, the WFP director, World Food Program director, has said that based on the staff on the ground, they've seen no evidence of Hamas taking aid. The New York Times reported that even IDF sources have admitted that that's not actually happening. 100 aid agencies who work in Gaza signed a letter asking Israel, not Hamas, to stop blocking the aid. So it's quite clear, unless the IDF, all these aid agencies, and Cindy McCain are all lying somehow, that Hamas is not taking the aid.
So you're working at USAID throughout all of this. And then at one point, you were due to deliver a presentation on child mortality amongst Palestinians. And that presentation was canceled. And you're given a choice, Alex, either to resign from the agency or to be fired. So tell us what happened and what was going through your head when you were presented with that choice.
Yeah, so this was supposed to be my way of coping with what I was seeing in the news every day, was that I was going to address my colleagues at USAID, most of whom are, quite pro-human rights. People who work at USAID tend to get into that sort of sector because they care about people and they want people to be healthy and safe. So I was very much preaching to the choir, talking about maternal and child health outcomes in Gaza before and after the assault starting in 2023. I submitted an abstract for this conference that was going to happen in May, all the way back in February 2024, and it was accepted. It went through many tiers of review, and the people reviewing it apparently thought it was a worthy topic, one that should be discussed at this conference. The day before I was supposed to give the lecture, I was told to edit my slides to remove words like Palestine. to remove specific terms, to remove any reference to international law and how it's illegal to starve populations. And I complied with those edits, and I even offered to do the presentation without slides if that would allow me to just have a conversation with my colleagues in a small room of maybe 30 to 40 people about this topic. The reasons I was told that I couldn't do it, and this is getting back to your question about what the atmosphere was like within USAID and state, they were incredibly frank with me. They told me to my face that the reason I wouldn't be able to present it the next day was because Blinken had decided to set aside this State Department report that said Israel was likely committing war crimes, and that we had to basically go along with his decision. And then the other reason they cited was that that day, 2 days before my presentation, happened to be the day when Karim Khan, the ICC prosecutor, requested a warrant for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. And that was big news. And that was, they said, making the situation more sensitive. So it was incredibly disappointing. The same day that I was hopefully going to give this presentation to 40 colleagues in a small room, Ron Dermer, the Israeli Minister of the Interior, announced on Sky News that there was no famine. There never had been any famine. And that went out to millions of people when I couldn't even talk to these few dozen people about what was really happening. And so you already mentioned my resignation letter. I talked about how I can't do my job when some people are considered people and some people are not. And talked about the contrast between our reaction to Ukraine being assaulted and our reaction to Gaza being assaulted even more so, and hospitals being bombed and a lot of the same sorts of crimes.
Yeah, I noted that in your letter because I thought it was so powerful to state the difference between the U.S. government response in Gaza and Ukraine, because not only did it show this glaring double standard, but it also showed that when the U.S. government wants to do something to address these issues, it certainly does. You also wrote in the letter to Samantha Power, because the letter was addressed to her, you said that you had read all her books on genocide and human rights and idealism, and that you expected that she would have spoken out or at least let others in the agency speak out. And I was curious when I read that. Did you ever get a response from her?
No, I didn't.
That's disappointing. Before I ask you sort of, lessons learned and what you would tell policymakers today, I just saw this post on X just now, a few minutes ago, from the official account of the Israeli government. And it is a video of a food market in Gaza. The caption says, "From fresh produce to candy and canned goods, Gaza City's markets offer it all. See the real footage for yourself. Yes, there is food in Gaza."
Cynical politicians and biased media are lying. The pictures don't. This is real footage of Gaza food markets, July to August 2025.
What do you say to that?
Yeah, this is an important point. It's important for people to understand that famine doesn't mean there is absolutely no food whatsoever. It's about access to food. The food can be in places where only some people can get to it. The food can be so astronomically expensive that people can't buy it. And also, obviously, pastries are not nutrition. Candy is not nutrition. So it's not about there being absolutely zero food whatsoever in the entire territory. It's about access to food. So even if there is a small amount, that doesn't make it less of a famine.
And of course, when food, as I've learned talking to people over these last couple of years, that when food is so scarce, obviously it causes the rise of a black market. Food becomes prohibitively expensive. people can't afford it. I was talking to someone from Gaza the other day who was talking about the price of a tomato. I mean, it was something astronomical, and people can't really afford it. And I just wanted to make another point that I think is really important as well, that when you are starving, you can't just eat any food, and you can't eat large quantities of food. Obviously, the food has to be reintroduced really carefully and deliberately into your system, or else you could die. So I just think that's something to keep in mind too, because it's not just about the quantity of aid going in. It's about the right kind of assistance for the people, depending on people's needs, depending on their level of where they are on that starvation scale, and having professionals be able to monitor and administer that reintroduction of food into the system.
That's absolutely correct. Food should be reintroduced in a very careful, medically supervised way. And obviously that's a problem in a place where 80% of the health facilities have been destroyed or damaged severely.
Yeah. So I want to close with just your reflections since your resignation. You and other colleagues of yours who have resigned, you've been going out, you've been very public. I've seen you in the media. You've been talking in so many places about the urgency of this moment and the responsibility of the international community at this moment in Gaza. What do you have to say to policymakers today?
My message to policymakers now is really that this needs to stop now. Tom Fletcher, the UN Humanitarian Affairs spokesperson, gave an address yesterday where he said directly to Netanyahu, enough, this needs to stop. As you know, even if aid is allowed in unrestricted today, there are many people who will still die as a consequence of the starvation that's already been inflicted. And if we don't stop it now, we're looking at thousands of deaths per day and exponential growth of the famine. Aid agencies are very clear. They say that what's needed is a ceasefire immediately so that aid can get in, that they can travel safely within Gaza, that deconfliction is no longer a problem. Deconfliction meaning having safe routes for aid workers. So far, 300 plus aid workers have been killed in Gaza. The famous example was the World Central Kitchen workers who were targeted 3 times. UN warehouses have been targeted. So that needs to stop.
And I just want to point out, we're recording this on a Sunday. As of today, Hamas has agreed to the latest ceasefire terms since last week, and the Israeli government has still not presented its response. So just to your point about the need for a ceasefire.
Yeah, hopefully outside pressure can make that happen, but it needs to be a lot more than what we're seeing now. Obviously, instead of GHF, we need to have people who know what they're doing, coordinating the humanitarian aid response. UNRWA needs to be funded and allowed back into Gaza because they are extremely good at what they do, which is distribution of aid, as well as all the education and other work that they do. UNRWA has the distribution networks, the thousands of local staff, those who are still alive, have the know-how to get those 400 distribution sites back up and running. Even the Biden administration, at the same time that they were cutting funds to UNRWA, admitted that UNRWA was absolutely indispensable as far as aid coordination. And then finally, I would say long term, there needs to be zero tolerance for starvation. A do-nothing approach to starvation is just not acceptable. We need to change ourselves socially and politically to not let this happen. Even at the outset, even when Yoav Gallant says we are going to starve these people, that needs to be the moment when things are triggered and sanctions are imposed. Meaningful consequences are imposed to stop this kind of thing from happening. And there needs to be accountability, not just for Israeli leaders, but also for people like Keir Starmer, who at the outset of the genocide said that Israel had the right to withhold food and water, saying that Israel had this right to protect herself, in his words. There needs to be accountability for that kind of complicity, that kind of crime as well.
And of course, on the US side, as we mentioned, all of those top officials that were providing cover over and over and over again for many months. And I'm glad that you ended on the accountability note. I've said before that I think a lot of what's happening now is happening because people like George W. Bush and Dick Cheney weren't held accountable. And that if we continue to allow people to evade accountability, then it is only natural that we're going to continue to see crimes like this happen and people die such tragic and preventable deaths. On that note, Alex, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your experiences and to talk to us about such an important issue at this really critical time. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a wonderful platform that you have.
I hope you found that conversation helpful and informative. If you'd like to support us in getting more of these kinds of conversations out there, please do follow us wherever you get your podcasts, subscribe to our videos on YouTube, and leave a comment so that we know what you're thinking. You can also always email us at jasmine@viewfromherepod.com. That's jasmine@viewfromherepod.com. As always, thank you so much for listening. I'm Jasmine El Gamal, and this is The View From Here.